Why torture is not what you think. When you hear the phrase torturing a narcissist, something inside you might flinch. Maybe it sounds cruel. Maybe it sounds dangerous. Or maybe if you've been hurt long enough, it sounds secretly satisfying. But what if I told you that the most devastating form of torture for a narcissist doesn't involve yelling, revenge, exposure, or confrontation at all? What if the thing they fear most is silence? Not the silent treatment, not coldness, but something far more unsettling, your emotional absence, your inner withdrawal. The moment when they realize, too late, that they are no longer the center of your psychological universe. Narcissists don't survive on love the way healthy relationships do. They survive on significance, on being essential, on knowing that your mood, your self-worth, your choices, and even your pain orbit around them. And when that gravitational pull weakens, when the spotlight quietly shifts away, something inside them begins to unravel. This story begins with a woman named Emily and a man named Daniel in the heart of New York City. From the outside, it looked like passion, intensity, chemistry. From the inside, it was confusion, self-doubt, and a slow erosion of identity. Emily thought she was trying to save a relationship. What she didn't realize was that she was feeding a system that only functions when someone else disappears. This is not a story about revenge. It's about consequences, about what happens when you stop performing, stop proving, stop explaining, and start reclaiming yourself, and why that single shift creates more psychological distress for a narcissist than any argument ever could. Before we go any further, if this kind of deep psychological insight speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps support the work, and it allows us to keep creating content that brings clarity, power, and healing to people who've lived too long in emotional fog. Now, a quick question for you. Answer in the comments. A or B? A. Narcissists are most hurt by confrontation and being called out. B. Narcissists are most hurt when they lose emotional significance. Comment A or B, and let's continue. Way number 1, reduce their significance. The quietest, most devastating shift. The most powerful shift Emily ever made wasn't loud. It wasn't announced. And it certainly wasn't meant to hurt anyone. In fact, from the outside, nothing seemed different at all. She still showed up. She was still polite. She still spoke calmly. But inside, something fundamental had changed. She stopped placing Daniel at the center of her inner world. Reducing a narcissist's significance is not about punishment. It's about reorientation. For years, Emily's emotional compass had been calibrated around Daniel, his moods, his approval, his reactions. If he was distant, she panicked. If he was warm, she relaxed. Without realizing it, she had made him the reference point for her sense of safety. The shift began when she noticed this pattern and gently withdrew her emotional investment from it. She no longer rushed to explain herself. She no longer tried to anticipate his feelings before honoring her own. Decisions that once required his validation became private, internal choices, not defiant, just autonomous. This is what narcissists experience as devastating. Narcissistic personalities depend on psychological centrality. They need to feel essential to your emotional regulation. When that role disappears, it creates disorientation. Daniel felt it before he could name it. A subtle loss of control, a creeping anxiety, the unsettling sense that his presence no longer carried the same weight. What makes this shift so powerful is its authenticity. It cannot be faked. Indifference performed as a tactic is still engagement, but genuine emotional reallocation, where your attention returns to your body, your values, your inner life, is something a narcissist can sense immediately. Emily didn't become colder. She became clearer, and in doing so, she unknowingly removed the very fuel that had sustained the dynamic. The quietest change became the most destabilizing one. Daniel was no longer emotionally necessary. That is where real power begins. Way number 2, grieve the fantasy, letting the illusion die. There is a moment in every narcissistic relationship that feels more frightening than leaving, more painful than confrontation, and more destabilizing than anger. It is the moment when you realize that what you are grieving is not the person in front of you, but the future you imagined with them. For Emily, this realization came quietly, not during an argument, not during a betrayal, but in stillness. Sitting alone, she finally allowed herself to admit the truth she had been bargaining with for years. The version of Daniel she loved was a promise, not a person. Grieving the fantasy is not weakness. It is the most courageous act in this entire process. The fantasy says if I'm patient enough, loving enough, understanding enough, he will become who he said he was. That belief keeps people trapped far longer than fear ever could. Hope becomes a leash, and narcissistic dynamics thrive on that hope because it keeps emotional supply flowing indefinitely. Grief breaks that cycle. Emily didn't grieve Daniel. She grieved the conversations that would never happen, the safety that never arrived, the partnership that existed only in her imagination. And when she allowed herself to fully feel that loss, without minimizing it, without romanticizing it, something irreversible occurred. The illusion collapsed. This is why narcissists fear grief more than anger. Anger is engagement, grief is withdrawal. Once the fantasy dies, their influence weakens dramatically. Attempts to pull you back intensify. Promises may resurface. Vulnerability may appear. But it lands differently now, because the spell has been broken. Grieving the fantasy doesn't harden you. It frees you. It closes a door that was never real and opens one that leads back to yourself. And once that door closes, the narcissist can feel it, because something they relied on is gone forever. Way number 3, challenge the false self without confrontation. At some point, Emily noticed something unsettling about Daniel. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, almost sad realization. Everything about him required confirmation. His confidence needed applause. His stories needed admiration. His pain needed an audience. What she was interacting with wasn't a stable sense of self, but a carefully maintained performance. That performance is what psychologists call the false self. Challenging the false self does not mean exposing it, criticizing it, or arguing against it. Confrontation only strengthens it. The false self feeds on resistance just as much as it feeds on praise. What destabilizes it is something far more subtle: neutrality. Emily stopped participating in the performance. When Daniel exaggerated, she didn't correct him, and she didn't admire him either. When he framed himself as superior or uniquely wounded, she responded with calm presence rather than emotional reinforcement. She didn't validate the illusion, but she didn't attack it. She simply allowed reality to exist without commentary. This is deeply uncomfortable for a narcissist. The false self depends on mirrors. It needs reflection to stay intact. When the mirror goes flat, when admiration, outrage, and reassurance disappear, the image begins to distort. Daniel started to feel it as an internal pressure he couldn't release. Irritability increased. His need to provoke grew stronger. But Emily remained grounded. This is not manipulation. It is withdrawal from illusion. By anchoring herself in what was observable rather than what was implied, Emily quietly reintroduced reality into the dynamic. She didn't argue about who Daniel was. She simply stopped confirming who he wanted to be seen as. That restraint requires strength. It also requires safety. If power dynamics are unequal, distance matters more than precision. But when done carefully, this shift is profoundly destabilizing. Because the narcissist is forced to confront a terrifying absence, a world that no longer reflects their fantasy back to them. And without that reflection, the false self begins to crack on its own. Weigh them for, build a life they can't access. The final shift did not involve Daniel at all, and that is precisely why it was the most powerful. Emily didn't wake up one day determined to hurt him. She woke up determined to live, not reactively, not defensively, but intentionally. And that decision marked the beginning of a life Daniel could no longer enter, influence, or control. For years, her world had been shaped around his gravity. Her friendships had quietly thinned. Her interests had been mocked or dismissed. Her joy had been conditional. As she began rebuilding, she did not do it loudly or performatively. She chose depth over display, presence over explanation. She moved cities. She reconnected with people who saw her clearly. She returned to passions she had abandoned not because they lacked value, but because they threatened his sense of superiority. Slowly, her days filled with meaning that had nothing to do with being understood by him. This is what narcissists cannot tolerate. They want to believe they leave permanent marks, that once they touch your life, you are forever altered in their image. Your healing contradicts that narrative. Your happiness without them feels like an erasure of their importance, not because they miss you, but because your independence exposes the truth they avoid. They were never the source of your strength. Daniel felt the distance grow not through silence, but through irrelevance. He no longer had access to Emily's emotional core. Her joy didn't require his approval. Her sadness didn't revolve around his absence. He became peripheral in a life that was once organized around him. Building a life they can't access is not revenge. It is sovereignty. It is choosing growth over fixation, expansion over entanglement. And while narcissists may circle back, attempt to reinsert themselves, or manufacture crises, the boundary holds, not because you enforce it, but because you no longer live where they can reach you. That is the final shift, and it changes everything. Advanced insight: why narcissists react with rage, panic, or collapse. When the shifts you've read about begin to take hold, many people are caught off guard by what comes next. The narcissist does not quietly fade away. Instead, their reactions often intensify. Rage appears where charm once lived. Panic surfaces beneath the confidence. In some cases, there is an emotional collapse that feels sudden and disproportionate. This response is not random, it is structural. Daniel was not reacting to Emily directly anymore. He was reacting to the loss of a psychological system that had once kept him stable. Narcissistic personalities rely on external regulation. Their sense of self is not internally anchored. It is propped up by attention, emotional reactions, and a steady flow of confirmation from others. When that supply weakens, the nervous system goes into alarm. What looks like cruelty or drama is often a form of psychological withdrawal. Rage emerges when control is threatened. Panic emerges when relevance is questioned. Collapse emerges when the false self can no longer be sustained. These reactions are not signs of hidden depth or sudden insight. They are survival responses to ego destabilization. This is where many survivors feel an overwhelming sense of guilt. Watching someone unravel can trigger compassion, doubt, or the urge to re-engage. Emily felt this pull too. But understanding the mechanism helped her resist it. She realized that stepping back was not abandonment. It was the end of emotional overfunctioning. What allowed her to stay grounded was tending to her own nervous system. Regulation replaced vigilance. Stillness replaced hyper-awareness. She learned that she was not responsible for stabilizing someone who had built their identity on external control. Not every narcissist reacts the same way, but the pattern is consistent. When the illusion loses its fuel, the system destabilizes. And the most important truth in this phase is this: clarity is not cruelty. Distance is not harm. You are not causing their reaction. You are simply no longer preventing it. That understanding is what allows healing to continue without turning back. Conclusion: the real victory is freedom. By the time Emily understood what had really happened, the word torture no longer felt accurate. What unfolded was quieter than vengeance and far more permanent. There were no final speeches, no dramatic exits, no moment where Daniel was confronted with a neatly packaged truth. Instead, there was something far more unsettling for him and far more liberating for her. She stopped centering her life around someone who could not meet her in reality. The real victory was not that Daniel felt distressed, confused, or destabilized. Those outcomes were incidental. The victory was that Emily no longer needed him to be anything in order for her life to move forward. She no longer needed closure from someone who thrived on withholding it. She no longer needed validation from someone who survived by extracting it from others. Freedom arrived not as a rush of triumph, but as calm, as space, as the absence of constant self-monitoring. Emily noticed that her thoughts returned to her body, her values, her future. She began making decisions without rehearsing how they would be received. She felt sadness without panic, joy without guilt, silence without dread. For narcissistic personalities, this is the greatest loss imaginable: not being hated, not being exposed, but not being needed, not being central, not being powerful in someone else's emotional world. This is why the path forward is not about becoming harder, colder, or more strategic. It is about becoming more real, more rooted, more sovereign. When you stop feeding a system that requires your self-erasure, it collapses under its own weight. Emily didn't win by defeating Daniel. She won by reclaiming herself. And that is the ending narcissistic dynamics cannot survive. If you are walking this path, remember this: clarity is not cruelty. Distance is not punishment. Choosing peace is not weakness. The moment you stop organizing your life around someone else's dysfunction, the story changes, not just for them, but for you. The real victory is freedom, and once you taste it, you don't go back. Emily's story is not unique, and that is precisely why it matters. What began as an intense connection slowly became a life organized around someone else's needs, moods, and illusions. Like many people entangled with a narcissistic personality, Emily did not lose herself overnight. She disappeared in small ways, silencing instincts, doubting perceptions, shrinking joy, and calling it love. The relationship didn't end because of one explosive moment. It ended because she quietly reclaimed her inner world. Through reducing emotional significance, grieving the fantasy, disengaging from illusion, and building a life that no longer revolved around Daniel, Emily didn't destroy anyone. She simply stopped abandoning herself. And in doing so, she exposed a profound truth: narcissistic dynamics only survive when someone else carries the emotional weight. The lesson here is not about winning or proving someone wrong. It's about recognizing that real power is internal. When you stop seeking validation from someone incapable of mutuality, clarity replaces confusion. When you stop managing another person's emotions, your nervous system begins to heal. And when you choose yourself, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, the entire dynamic changes. You don't need to confront, expose, or punish to move forward. You need boundaries, grief, and a willingness to tolerate the discomfort of growth. Applied to real life, this means learning to trust your inner signals, investing in support systems that don't require self-erasure, and choosing relationships where reciprocity, not intensity, is the foundation. Disclaimer, this video is for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis or psychological treatment from a licensed mental health provider. Now, a quick question for you. Comment below with your answer. A or B? A. Healing means getting closure from the narcissist. B. Healing means reclaiming yourself with or without closure. What's your perspective on Emily's journey? Have you experienced something similar or do you see it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience. And if this content resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, healing-focused content like this.